So welcome. This is the first of two lessons that is going to be looking at coding with the web self-service API. This is a COM API, so we're going to be dealing with essentially things that build on our experience of using ASP pages already. So we're going to be using methods and objects and properties very similar to the type of thing that we looked at in all of the ASP pages and also the lessons that we dealt with when we were considering the the general idea of scripting within things like table and entity level scripts, and also within our screen rules like create scripts and validate scripts. We've got to consider, though, what self-service is. It's all right saying, oh, it's just an API, but it's actually a little bit more than that. I think it's a bit like taking the concept of CRM and turning it inside out, so that instead of experiencing the concept of CRM within an organizational processes, we're not looking at it from the perspective of the user of CRM, but we're actually looking at it from the customer's own perspective. Consider this. Here I'm working with the interface. I've logged on as a system administrator. I can go now into the different screens. I can go and think about leads. I might want to search for leads. I might want to actually create a new lead. There we are. Look, if I create a new lead, I can determine that what I want to do is to create this for, let's have a look at last go. Let's have a look at last go records, and let's put Richards as the name of the person there, and I enter the lead details. So you can see I'm capturing these details. It's a manual process by which I'm probably recording something that's taking place on the telephone, and this is a 30 user time management lead, and they've got 30 people in 4 offices with whatever the situation is, and I'd fill in the details. But that's, if you like, me capturing the information and maybe getting errors. I'm certainly having to reach out, collect the information that I want, and I am here battling with what I want to find out from the customer and what the customer wants to give me. But it can be turned inside out. Instead of looking at this information, I could look at incorporating CRM into a corporate website, so the visitors to that website actually implicitly are using CRM, but they don't know that they're using CRM. So if I look at this little demo site that I've got here, this could be a self-service site for any particular instance, and we could go in to look at the idea of registering for a newsletter. Well, the very act of registering for a newsletter, I'm being asked to put some information in here. And well, if I go and say that this is, let's have a look at last chance records. Oops, last chance records, and put in the names here. It's the user themselves who entering in the details. And so the chances are they are deliberately deciding what information they want to share, and you can design an interface to make it very easy for people to be able to provide the information in which you're interested in, because you can have a dialogue, forms which just capture a little bit, move on, discuss things, and so on. You can actually create a way of collecting information very, very easily, and the customer is not aware that they are using CRM, but rather they are registering for information that they want, that they are trying to submit work that they want, and that they are very much viewing this concept from their perspective of wanting to make their lives easier, and that may well mean that they're sharing information that make our lives easier, because it's a way of disintermediating the using this. Paul's asked the question, can any website consume the self-service DLL and therefore incorporate self-service? We'll look at this in a little bit later, but essentially this is a COM-based web service, and we'll see its architecture a little bit later on. So we can use just about any aspect of the API that we want. It has its own particular strength, so it plays best within ASP and ASPX type environments, which are generating an interface, and you can get things to work with an ASPX page, but typically it's an ASP page, so it works fine in those places. If you're using something like PHP, then it's a different application design philosophy. So really, and especially, you'd need to think about what's the web server that the website is on. So we'll consider the technology that we're using, and that will determine in which circumstances this can be used. Bear with me, and we will hit that idea in a moment. But whereas I've been entering my lead in here, if I cancel this and now go back to searching for a lead and I look for my last chance records, you can see that actually here I've just gone ahead and created that last chance record directly into the CRM system. I've turned CRM inside out. I've driven this from the user's perspective. I've removed some of the obstacles within that chain before the data arrives within the system, and what's more, we'll find that the customer actually can take ownership of this as well. So if I look to the support areas, you can see that I'm already logged in as Gareth McDade. Let me just log out of that. I should have done that earlier on, but let's if I log on again and try this once more, you can see that I'm looking at the support area, and from again, this is a way in which the user or the visitor to the corporate website can decide to take ownership of a particular part of a process. They can generate work, they can review work, they can edit work. Whether they think that they're editing work or not is a different matter, but they are participating within workflows. And if I look to the company, Eurolandia, and down in amongst the people of the company, I can see my person, Gareth McDade, and in here there's a tab called self-service. Now the self-service tab is added into the system when you install CRM with the self-service license, so it's inbuilt into this. But you can see I've enabled Gareth so that he can log on into the system. Let me change back that license. I'll talk about the language that he uses in a moment. So he's using here the language that the system is using. So there's my Gareth McDade. We'll see that translation is relevant as well, potentially. So McDade can log on. And I log on, and what we'll find as we log on here is that he's able to review the information contained within inside this environment. He can look at cases that were logged by people on his behalf. He can review cases or support issues that he logged directly through the website. So this is the sort of thing that we would have within inside a self-service environment, where the user, or sorry, the visitor to the website can directly interact with the work that we have within inside CRM, and that can be confirming that then details are correct, confirming that that things match, scheduling visits by an engineer, scheduling requests for information. And for example, I might want to report a problem straight away here, and I might actually say, in this particular case, the print driver is creating misaligned columns, and I put the problem details in there, choose save, and if I have a look at my overview, you can see that that particular case has been logged. And if I go back to where we've got the cases associated with Gareth McDade, and you can see that in here a new case has been created where the problem has been logged that the print driver is creating misaligned columns. Now, the exact information that is logged is entirely under our control as the system administrator. So if you want to make more information available for the person to enter or to maintain, then we can do that. Now, will that trigger any workflow in the entry rule for the case? Well, that's a very good case. You can see that I've arrived at a point where it's outside of the workflow. But when we look at the way in which we code, we create our pages, we could, if we wanted to, when we come on to the insertion of records, automatically attach records into workflow, into a particular workflow state, just as we can with inside standard ASP pages. And so all the stuff that I was looking at earlier on, we can do. But what you can't have, though, is that although this person can drill down and look and change information within this screen, what you can't do with inside the self-service pages is directly create the workflow buttons that we know about and we think about. And this is down to the fact that the workflow depends on session information, and that's actually something that we're going to come on to in a little bit, because there are some constraints with using self-service because we're not using the main CRM interface. So we've seen that we can work in a way in which a customer can visit the company website. They can provide credentials. These credentials can give them secure access to any parts of the system that you want. Now, that level of security, though, has to be something that you are mindful about, and in the next lesson we'll actually be looking at that and considering that in some more detail. But once we have done that, and that maybe records are inserted potentially in much the same way as they are inserted through the main interface. So they could trigger validation behavior, create scripts, they can trigger behavior around table level scripts, they can trigger workflow. And that might drive out messages to the people that the work is automatically being assigned to, or anything that you might want. Your limitation here is really within your imagination as to what you want to do. But you can easily have escalation rules firing when somebody logs a new case or logs a new lead. We're going to see, as we start our coding, that the great thing about this is that we know already how to code self-service. We know the objects, we know the methods, we know how to set those properties. We're not going to be seeing anything that you haven't seen before. And because we've got complete control over this, we can be as dynamic as we want to integrate with any aspects of the corporate website that you're using. Now, with the proviso of the architecture, which I will mention about in a moment. And also we will need to have security in our uppermost minds. And this is because when we're working within the main interface, as a user of CRM, we are essentially spoilt as we are doing work. We're spoilt because we make use of a mechanism called the session ID, which then triggers all sorts of security, territory, and group behavior. Would I recommend running the escalation and email manager on the same server? Yes, you can't actually shift those services really convenient. Well, the expectation if you're working within a multi-server environment is that you would have one server which has got the escalation and email manager on those servers, and you might have other services within a running on another one. There is, if you're wanting to know specifically more about, so if you are using self-service, you are using things like the escalation service and the email manager, if you go within the community, and all members of the developer program have access to these, you should find within the e-learning area there are support areas that will guide you through those particular topics. So you've got concepts on multi-server that you should be able to access. So as the videos are coming soon, I'm aware that my colleagues have created resources and documents about that, and so they should be up on the knowledge base as well. Okay, so I'm going back into CRM, and hopefully that's actually giving you the information that you wanted. Now, this is what I was saying about it depends on the architecture. Now, Sage CRM, when we come to installing Sage CRM, we are used to the idea, hopefully by now, that we might have several instances of CRM on our own laptops and our own development machines. And certainly if you look at my registry, you can see that I've got quite a few instances of Sage CRM installed. Although all the way through this particular course I've only been using one, or well, two instances. I use for the component manager, a second one as well. But CRM 7.3 is the one that I've been using, and you'll notice that we have the registry settings for it. But do you notice how within our self-service there is only a single self-service set of definitions? And this is a harsh thing to say, is that you can only have within a production environment CRM and self-service there. You can't have self-service working with multiple instances. So you run into problems if for example I've installed CRM 7.3, I develop a self-service site, and you'll see that it's registered for me and it's thinking it's working with CRM 7.3. And if I came along and I installed another instance, for example, I might install my X3 instance, what would happen is that as I reinstalled that, it would change the registry settings so that self-service was no longer working with my own home instance. So it's an important thing to realize is that the installation of self-service is integral to the installation of Sage CRM proper, and you can only have within a production environment one instance of CRM, because otherwise you blow apart potentially self-service and stop anything working. But the real world needs to be able to have the idea that we work with an instance of CRM within the secure network. So we have our CRM database that we want to access here within one server, but somehow we want our self-service site to be publicly exposed, where people can access it and obviously be able to log information, but they won't be able to access and log on to this interface, not unless they go onto the VPN. But this is the public area. Now, if that's the case, you run into the problem that when we come to install Sage CRM, and let's switch across into the install shield, hopefully everyone's seen this screen. So if I start the process of installing CRM, and I'm not actually going to install the full product, I just want to get to the point where I'm looking at changing an existing install. Then when we come onto this, we're going to be making a number of different changes. If we were to go through an install, we would make changes to the database, to the self-service database, to registry, program files, IIS alias, and the license key. All those things get potentially changed as we install. And what we can do, what we have to realize is that when we install CRM, we install self-service with it. So if we want to separate them out onto two separate servers, there actually has to be a second install of CRM on the public-facing server. So we set it up, IIS, with ASP pages, install self-service, and also install CRM with the correct license, and we get it. Now we can see that in my instance of CRM, I have in administration, within the system area, within the license key details, I have got self-service. So in my environment here, I end up with two instances of CRM with two registrations of the self-service details, but I'm only going to use one server for self-service and the other server for the main application data. And we can go and set this up so that when requests come into the system, we route things to the appropriate server, including database. Some things to point out. I'm going to go in and look at database settings, but within my environment, if I look to the database, we can see in my database, I've actually got here a database called self-service with tables visitor and visitor profile. These get installed when we install CRM, and obviously we have the CRM server elsewhere. We can choose to decide whether CRM is working with its database in one location or somewhere else. And if I also consider the idea that, well, this is something that we've already dealt with, is that the user is accessing the interface with inside CRM, is consuming a license, whereas a visitor is accessing the corporate website and is therefore represented with inside the system in a different way, both in the visitor table and also through representations within the person table. So we've done all this. We've looked at the idea that we can go ahead, we can create a new lead, not to be confused with the web to lead feature. That's something that is dealt with lessons that are on the community. for the main e-learning system. We can also look at promoting leads into a company and opportunity, ultimately then assigning self-service logons to the created contact, who then can do any of the work that they may want. So this is all good. This is all what we can do. They can log cases. We've seen this, and that was our McDade able to log on. This is where we're talking about. We've got the registration here, creating the reality that we have to be careful about the way in which it's set up. Now, we will find ourselves using this separate instance of CRM called the eWare self-service object. It's COM object registered within the context. And just like the IIS, and just like ASP pages are relying on the library of the ASP extension to web servers, so self-service relies on the ASP extension self-service to iOS to then use the COM object. But our self-service object, as we've got, we can find that we control the registries underneath the self-service area. Now, the first tab we come onto by default is simply allowing us to show which visitors are in and on the site. The important aspect is the self-service configuration here, and what we meet is that we have these different databases, and so we can configure our servers to work as we've got like this. So we can configure this with those two settings. So we point the main CRM install to the enterprise database server, and we point the self-service database in the correct location as well. And you can imagine making the corresponding changes in these two instances. And that would allow you to have your database off on another, your self-service instance and its database off on one place, and then have the main enterprise system elsewhere. And you would configure the contact through to these database servers through the correct port as well. So that's part of the setup of the client tools within the remote machine. Okay, so we've looked at these items, and we need to actually go ahead and start the process of constructing our page. So how do we go ahead and do this? Well, we have to think about the reality of the mechanism for page construction and work on the basis that really we have anonymous access and we have authenticated access. In today's lesson, I'm only going to concentrate on anonymous access because we have to go through the setup of the initial website as well. We have to look at what resources are available to help us get going with our site. And then I'll look at the idea of how the screens can be built and controlled to allow us to construct the pages that we want. So we've got the sense of how we would do this, and we can then set the scene for when we'll look at, when we're dealing with authenticated usage, the whole process of constructing a log-on page, log-off, because we have to manage the session, the authentication of the visitor, and we have to think about how we might maintain the visitor details, how we create search pages or list pages which contain the information for the cases and allow us to create new work. All of this in the course of the next lesson, we look at the full CRUD, create, read, update and delete, using the self-service API. But there are some realities that we have to understand. As we come into code, we are going to discover that it looks like the APIs that we know, but there are limitations because the whole idea of interaction rests on using a completely different authentication token. When we're dealing with the main interface, we provide our username and password, and we see that we get a SID added in. So it's using this as a mechanism for the context and also the session management. When we look at our sample, our self-service page, you can see none of this information. A little bit of contextual information is placed in the URL, and that URL can grow with contextual information that you want to add in, but what it doesn't contain up here is any information about the session, because that's maintained by default using a cookie. Although you can add in additional levels if you want to, double checking that a cookie and a session ID might match, but you can manage that idea or visitor session yourself. So block usage is very nuanced, and we'll see as I come to work there are some things that we can't use because they make definite usage of the idea of session. Their buttons, get tabs, get URL, for example, all wants to add in information about the session. And that even affects individual fields as well. So we'll see in the course of tomorrow, as we're starting to edit information, that fields such as the search select advanced fields can't work properly in edit mode because they are displaying information drawn through a iframe that needs to display the correct information and needs to pull that information up. Doesn't work because the URLs would be wrong because we don't have the session. And we would find that even writing out and constructing pages are all wrong because, of course, when we're running here, we don't have the concept of territories and we don't have the concept of security that we do inside the main interface. And because the whole page architecture is different, because we don't have the navigational elements, we can't use the methods of add content and the get page to allow us to construct our pages. So we end up having to use a different form, of simpler form of simply generating the HTML of the page and then writing that out. So we use myblock.execute directly to write out the contents of the page. But what I want to do is get going, and the rest of the lesson is now going to be essentially practical as we move towards creating our own self-service site. Now I think that what I want to do is to create a brand new site similar to self-service demo. And if you look inside the system, you'll find that there are a lot of self-service resources. So if I look at self-service roundup, you'll see that there should be a roundup of articles about self-service, and it talks about how we install self-service, how we work with this, but there are even self-service starter pages or starter resources that we can use. And so you can see how we can download and get hold of these the zip file with the self-service pages. Another way of doing this is if we look at self-service starter, we should get to the Schloss Schwamberg example, which is an older case study, but actually has some very useful starter files that can be used for the purposes of self-service. And it's largely on the idea of includes. Now, I've downloaded this earlier on. If I go off to where my files are held, you can see that I've downloaded Schloss Swanberg already onto my machine. And there are some useful stuff in here. There are some images and includes that we might want to take, and I can liberate those and use them wherever I want. But the question is, wherever I want. You'll notice back up at this level, if I go up to the level, you can see this is where I'm looking at is program files at Sage CRM. So this is obviously where CRM is installed, and you can see my install here. But you'll also notice that there are different versions of the self-service site also installed at this point as well. So you have the CRM self-service demo. If I look at this within the web server, we can see that that CRM self-service is set up actually as an application. So if I look at the browse the advanced settings, we can see here that it's been set up, it's working with the same application pool, it's pointing down to that location within the program files folder, and that's where it is, and the virtual path is CRM self-service demo. But we might not want to put it there. We don't have to put it there. We can actually have, for an instance of CRM, now although self-service can only be installed once for the, or against the instance of CRM once, and if you've blown the things away, you actually have to go through and do an update of the registry settings. But let's assume that you've got a nice CRM database that you want to work and show off for different self-service scenarios. You could create multiple demo self-service websites which will all point back to that particular instance of CRM that you're using. So what do we do here? Well, what we do here is I go off to where I want self-service to be created, and I could create here a new folder. Notice where I've gone down into the into inet pub www root. This is the home network where we would expect IIS to have any of its folders. And if I choose new, I can actually go and create this as, what day is it today? We are Thursday. And I can say that this is the Thursday PM session. You might notice that I've already created a Thursday AM session. So you can see that I've been practicing to make sure that things work already. Now, if I look at my Schloss Swanberg area, I'm going to steal a couple of these files, which I know I want to use. The includes are the important things, and I'm taking the CSS files. Well, I put those in here. I don't actually need all of the includes because they're very particular to the includes. The only one that I really need is this idea of the ewaress.js file. So there's very few files that you need to get going within a self-service page. And I might even want, and you'll notice that one of the things that we'll do is use cascading style sheets. And if I want to be really clever, I can go off to where I've got CRM installed. I can go down into CRM, down into www root, down into the themes, down into where we've got our ergonomic CSS file. This is the new look and feel. It's not, you're not, and this is, by the way, seriously, you're not just going to pick up CRM's cascading style sheet, but here this is pretending it is a corporate one, and I can place this in here, and I'll come back to the way in which we can control our experience. But I hear you say, but surely, Jeff, there are no files there that would show up on the web server, and you're quite right, if I choose to say new text document in here, and I'll call this default.asp, and I will edit this. Let's go and open it in TextPad, and I'll say hello world. We have a text file that I can now browse to. So if I go to localhost Thursday PM, if I do Thursday PM and hit return, you can see I've got a what did I call? Oh, I've called that the wrong path. Go in here to Thursday PM. What we will find is that it's redirected automatically because we've put it in as an ASP page as default as well. The web server has found that particular default file. So it's working as a website, but it's not actually a web application yet. So I need now to come back into where I've got myself, how I've got my web server. And if I refresh the sites here, you'll see that I've got the folder recognized as Thursday PM. And so here I can now create this actually as an application. So I'm going to convert this to an application, and we'll keep with the alias as the same name. The physical path is where this is, but I'm now going to choose to link it to the 7.3 application pool. Choose OK and OK, and so they're tied together. And if I go to this is still working. It doesn't make any difference from this simple ASP page, but it does mean that from now on I would be able to start using the features of self-service. We can work with self-service in a couple of ways. So for example, I'm going to start by editing within TextPad, but as we know, we can work with JavaScript files, and if we right mouse click and insert snippet, we can edit our ASP pages using any of the snippets within inside here, inside a text file, inside Visual Studio. So what am I going to do? What now? This is registered as a example. What do I have to do? Well, I have to basically start creating a simple self-service page. My intention is to list out all of the solutions associated with the system. So if I go into my find pages, look at solution, not lead, and look at solution and find these. This is the knowledge base, and it's a typical thing that you would provide maybe as an anonymous, with an anonymous area, so anyone can see how to solve problems. And you can see here that I've got a range of different items, 20 items, some of which are published or not. Now, when we come to working with self-service, we use the pages in the same way that we would expect a page to be built in the main interface. So it's a question of retrieving blocks to have those blocks work with views to retrieve the data that you want, and then to generate the HTML and send it to the web browser. It's not, frankly, difficult, but it's a deliberate set of actions that we need to take. So if I'm working with solutions, I should really make sure I go into the administration screens and I design the views and the lists and the screens that I want to use in a very deliberate way. In my case, this is to do with the secondary entity, which is the solutions entity. So I look down here and I want to create a new view. Now you can see in amongst the standard information that is created, you'll see that there is a example called SS Solutions entry within the screens. Within the lists, there is an SS Solutions grid. Anything that inside CRM by default that is added in by the install shields indicates the fact that they're associated with self-service by prefixing them with SS. If I look at the definition of the SS Solutions grid, we can see that it is based on a particular view. And if I cancel that and look at a view, that SS Solutions view, which the list uses, is automatically filtering to exclude anything that was deleted and anything that is not published. So it's only retrieving things which are still current and are of the status published. Well, that's good and that's fine, but actually I want to show you a little bit more about the way in which we can work. So in fact, here you can see I created a new view called V Self-Service Solutions, which is a very simple view which is only retrieving current or active, still existent, non-deleted solutions. And then I use, so that is designed for self-service, and then I've gone into the lists and I created another list here, which if we look at the options here, we've provided it with a name and we've indicated the view that this information is from. And I've added in the various columns that we want to write out. So the status, the description, the area, and the date. And all of those might be what I want to display. So how do we get going with that first page? We know what our list is. We know it's based on the view. Our basic structure is going to look a little bit like this. You can see that what I'm doing is using some snippets. If you've downloaded the TextPad snippets, you will have these available to you. And as you look at the snippets here, you'll see that it's similar, but slightly different from the way in which the main ASP pages work. In our page here, rather than having an include file which simply declares the language, I've got the body of this page with our JavaScript, and you can see that here that it's declaring the language to be JavaScript, and we're carrying out an include for the eware.js file. Now in my system, the include folder for the eware ss.js file is actually held in a subfolder called includes. So I will need to change the path for that within the snippet. But you can see here within the eware ss.js file that the principal thing that we're doing is creating an object called the eware object. And there are also some functions that are defined in here that I'll return to in the next lesson. But our eware.ess.js file exists and we're including it. I just need to make sure that the path is correct. Now I realize I've been talking continually for a moment. Let's see if there are some questions. The There's a question about the snippets for self-service. No, the Visual Studio snippets don't include these additional elements for self-service, largely because in the real world it becomes so very strange as to what a corporate website is going to look like. I'm not going to force people into a particular way of including the information. So sorry about that cough there. So Dwayne, you'll need to use the TextPad snippets or have a look at the TextPad snippets until you're comfortable with what the tasks are that you need to do, and then within the corporate environment you would essentially duplicate the tasks, probably with far more include files to make sure that things are built as easily as possible. Now, Michelle, you've asked a question. How difficult would it be to create an application for someone to come into self-service and complete and submit the application? When I say application, I'm referring to someone completing this is an application form. So this is where somebody wants to apply for a housing program or to apply for rooms or accommodation, I guess. Michelle, is that correct? It would be very easy. So you could, assuming that your website supports and is based on IIS, ideal if you can then make it work with classic ASP pages. You have an area of your site that maybe even through an iframe delivers this into where you want the form. You create a form that people submit the information. Now we will look in the course of next lesson at the whole create, read, update and delete mechanism. And so you would see that you've got the options there of working with anonymous, where people actually don't need to log on to create an account on your site, or where they have created an account on your site and you can integrate with the idea of they must have credentials. So we can do that in a number of ways. So let's assume that that's the case, and if I dock the pane, I've just docked that chat window out of the way, I can carry on with looking at the editing of our page here. You'll see that what I've got, as I've written this, I've added in reference to the includes file, and if I switch now into my browser where I had this and refresh, we should get a nice blank page. So it is working, so there's no errors, and that tells me that this particular page has successfully instantiated the eWare object, which is then referenced and aliased in the rest of the code to be the standard CRM object, which I've talked about all the way through. But within that instantiation of the object, you can see we're doing a server.create object, and it's saying it's eWare self-service. So this is the self-service object that we've talked about within the registry. And what it is a separate registration of the main eWare object. And so it's a slightly different version of it that we gain access to, and you can see its mechanism for instantiation is somewhat different. Okay, within our page though, let's move through the constants. We can see that the page is referencing a style sheet. I'll talk about why we're referencing, or I'm referencing, the eWare.css file in a moment, but we can assume that what you have to do is you have to manage the whole idea of headers and footers in the same way, headers and the end body in the same way as you would in any corporate website. But here I've got the main code, And inside here, this is where we would do the anonymous work. And we're down to the level of, if I want to display my list of solutions, what would I do? What would I do, in fact, in the main interface? I would need to think about get the block from metadata. Now this is the list block, so it's important to realize that a list block has got an implicit a list block has got an implicit SQL statement associated with it, so we would be saying what the view is, select star from view. And once we've got the list block, all we have to do is generate the HTML. So we execute the block, and then we send the block, or send the HTML to the browser. So we've got a very limited range of things that we have to do. And we've seen the work that we've done here. We know we've had to create our own view. We've created our own clearly labeled list. And so now I can choose to use standard snippets to allow me to create the block that I want. I'll call this my solution list. So I've created a solution list block, and we can then execute that and send it out. So if I choose to send it out through self-service here, we've got the information now. That's the solution block that I'm executing, but I'm not passing in an argument at this stage. So how many lines have I written of code? I've written 2 lines of code. I might want to do a little bit of tidying up. I might want to say, tell you what, let's change its width to 100% to include its, send it across the entire screen, and I might even want to put a title in place. Now, I'll come back to the title in a moment. I'll save that for a moment, but let's have a look at what we've done if I now look at my default page. And what we see is I've written out not a very attractive grid. But the settings are all coming from the standard CRM places that we would want. Now you'll see that it's brightly colored, and there are very definite style associated with the page. Now my style isn't going to get me any awards. I'm not anticipating a design award. If I right mouse click though and inspect the element, what we can see is that the code that gets generated actually gets generated with class labels to indicate which class should be picked up. Now, corporate website web designers sometimes hate this because we're adding new classes which may muck up a corporate web page. But our choice here is twofold. Either what we can do is within the code that we have, where we are executing, we could actually execute that to a variable and not actually return it directly to be sent to the screen. We could execute to generate the HTML and then parse the generated string with a regular expression to remove all mentions of classes. So we can actually go through and strip those out. And that's what some people do. And that would mean that your generated code would then adhere to whatever was the broad style choices for tables, etc. within inside the system. But the alternative is to say, well, let's have a look at adding the idea of the different styles, and this is where I'm going to switch over into a visual editor like this, because it gets so far, but really it's a bit silly doing it myself here. If I look at my page, which is underneath, I remember where it is underneath the C drive, underneath iNet Pub, underneath www.root, underneath Thursday PM, and I can open up these files. There's my file in here. You can see that it's perfectly happy for me to deal with the JavaScript in the ASP page. So I can now right mouse click, insert snippet, and you can see I can carry on using the snippets that we're used to using inside here. So I'll switch over in a moment to using this environment. But our page that we've got all executed server side, as we can see here, our page that we've got, we need to be able to think about changing and working with a different style sheet. And that corporate style sheet just needs to incorporate the appropriate styles that we use. So it might be that a designer finds it just as easy to take into account all of the different styles that we use. That's probably not as likely as that. You probably may find that people prefer in a corporate environment to strip out the class references. But that's just a relatively simple bit of processing using a regular expression. But having done that, we can change and show the power of changing the let's do it inside here, shall we? If I go back to my default.asp page and actually change my style sheet reference, I can do that. There's my ergonomic, which is the name of the style sheet. And now if I close this down and refresh this page, you can see that my style sheet has changed and it looks different. It actually doesn't look too bad anymore. There are other things that we need to be aware of when we are working with the created pages, is that some things work very much like the main interface and some things don't. Now consider here, I've got over here a link through to an image. This is because inside my page where I have this defined, I asked for the status field to be represented as show select as GIF. Now we've considered this way back in the courses when we were looking at the idea of views and the whole case color column. So we know how to do this. You might not remember, but we have looked at it. And if I go into where we've got CRM installed, underneath the themes area, underneath images, underneath ergonomic, because that's the default theme for the application, and by that this is the default theme that is set within the application within inside the system area. So we're choosing the fact that we've got the default system theme is set to be contemporary, which actually translates to being ergonomic. That's its internal name, and that means that when we look at choices and we look down in the choices it's finding the solution status field, and you can see the images that are used. And so those images would have to exist on your self-service database, and that's the path if you've chosen that. And so those are represented inside this list. And of course, you could make a reasonable decision to have different images that the customer sees or the visitor sees rather than a user sees. You can change these in any way that you like. Not if you're using the same database though, but if you've moved off separately onto separate servers, then you can do that because it picks up the path correctly. We've got our description, we've got our area, we've got all of these, and we're following the rules of whatever we've set our list to be like inside here. So it's following the rules that we've set up. We can change as well properties of the page, because if I switch over now into the code, I can think about the user experience from a language perspective. So I've got my block here, and I could add in another property. So if I say there's my solution list block and I say title, I can use CRM dot get trans, and I can use a translation feature. So this is telling us that it works just like the regular interface because it's going to pick up translations appropriate to the visitor. Now this is anonymous here, so this visitor, this isn't picking up, it's not going to change language, but I'll show you in a moment that it will. But if I type in tab names, and here type in solutions, and choose save, that translation will be picked up within the interface. Now there is no user using this at the moment, so it's rather and it's written it up into the corner because of course I'm not framing it in within any other structure, so it's written off into an odd little place. It's right hard against there. Typically we would want to put this into a container and make it a little bit nicer, especially if you want to add in other buttons, etc. into this page. But I've got my solutions up here, and I said that that's following translations, and you can see it's written out in uppercase when I wrote it out in lowercase in here, or mixed case, probably caps capitalized. If I go back to my user experience here and I'm looking at the overview, you can see that my user, who is Gareth McDade, you can see I'm logged on as Gareth McDade, is seeing things in English. He's seeing things in English because, well, because that's the language that Gareth is configured to use. But I could change this so that they use any language. Now this is very important for a customer differentiation. If you think about customer experience, then you need to think about not your own system requirements. So for example, I was training the guys from the Singapore office, and they work with the guys from Malaysia and the guys from Thailand all the time, and China. And what you can have is although English is the language of business within Singapore, your customers may prefer to interact with your websites using either Malay or Thai or what other language, and so you'd want to be able to provide the appropriate interface for that user. So there's my Eurolandia, I go to the people, Gareth McDade, and now if I look at his self-service tab and change his language away from US English to German, you can see as I access this page and refresh it again, immediately it has changed to here the items which are generated from within inside the self-service area and not part of the website, but the things that are generated from inside the system, you can see are translated, and that is the feature of that is a feature of the translation coming through. Interestingly, within other areas, Sage self-service does support this concept that if it knows that the user is or the visitor to the site uses a particular language, you can have it configured to load in files with various HTML. So the whole page can easily become dynamic based on the language that the self-service visitor has as it's held inside CRM. And so you could have a wider change to the entire corporate website. Okay, so we've seen there some very simple behavior, and if I want to now restrict things, then the usage within the block in the same way can be done. So I can either use arg_obj equals, and in here sol status equals published. So if I change that now and refresh that, we can see that we narrow this down. We can see that we've got that ability, or if you don't like that particular way of doing it, you can also revert to the idea of the argument string that we've used before and passing the argument into the execute method. So the same, you've got two ways of achieving the result. So we've got to the point now, there are a little website looks pretty good, as in it's doing what I set out to do, which is to serve up well presented the information from the system. If I switch into my presentation, we can just check to see if anything else needs to be mentioned. We're going to be looking at the management of the sessions in the next lesson. We'll be looking at all of the idea of how we work with authentication, forcing authentication. We're looking at the check, the way in which the cookie is created, how the cookie is read, how the cookie is destroyed, and how we can check for any errors in the process of authentication as well, and how we then control navigation through the different structures. We've seen in the code that we've been writing the types of objects that we can use for self-service. We know that we very much focused on data, not present. We look on data and presentation, which is not dependent on the session. And we've also seen by inference the objects which we can't use in self-service and the methods that we can't use because, well, it's not there. You know, we can't use get context, we can't use the button, we can't use the crm.url method because, well, because the session ID is just not present. Paul's asked a question about the code that I wrote here, which were the two ways of working within the argument passed into the execute method, and the argument expressed at the level of the block. You see the difference between the two much more clearly if we are working with a container. Imagine where we might have several blocks contained inside the screen. And this might well be down to something like a record being retrieved. If you've got several screens, each needing to display a separate record, the argument object allows you to associate with the different blocks, the different records, or the different where clauses. But the execute method, if used on a container containing several blocks, will pass that argument string or that object to each of the items contained within inside that container. That's something I did think I mentioned when we were looking at the complex pages, but you'll find that there are some articles which discuss that idea within the community articles around ASP pages. Hopefully, Paul, that answered that particular question. Yeah, that means that you can filter each block, and they can have very different filters rather than through the main execute method, which every block within that container would have to follow. Okay. Well, we're just about at the end of the discussion, and I think that we're all set for the next lesson, and we're going to be making that much more complex. So let's see if anyone has got last questions.